somewhere beneath the ground, inside mountains, and even beneath modern cities. There are places that should have disappeared completely. A prehistoric settlement buried for thousands of years, an ancient city hidden beneath the Amazon forest, a Roman port that once connected Egypt to India, and a forgotten kingdom whose palace record survived only because the city burned. But the deeper we go, the stranger these places become. We'll uncover cities built from mud brick, stone, and earth, fortresses carved into mountains, buried settlements, ancient ports, royal capitals, and archaeological sites where we still don't know exactly who built them or why they were abandoned. Some were once powerful centers connected to enormous trade networks. Others were hidden for centuries beneath soil, forests, and modern landscapes. And the most fascinating part? In many of these places, the ruins are only giving us pieces of the story. So let's begin and uncover 21 forgotten places that still have something to reveal. The limestone fortress of Tamagusuku. On a rocky hill overlooking the southern coast of Okinawa, the remains of an ancient fortress follow the contours of the limestone landscape. There is no thick layer of mortar holding the walls together. Instead, large stones were carefully selected, shaped where necessary, and fitted together to create a defensive structure that has endured for centuries. This is Tamagusuku, one of the oldest known Gusuku fortresses on Okinawa. The fortress stands in the southern part of Okinawa Island, on elevated ground surrounded by the distinctive limestone terrain of the Ryukyu Islands. From the summit, the surrounding landscape opens toward the coast. That position gave the fortress an important natural advantage. The higher ground provided visibility, while the steep terrain made direct access more difficult. Tamagusuku belongs to the tradition of Gusuku, the fortified stone settlements and strongholds that developed across the Ryukyu Islands during the medieval period. These structures were not simply castles in the European sense. They could serve political, religious, administrative, and defensive purposes. The walls at Tamagusuku are particularly interesting because of their construction. Rather than relying heavily on mortar, the builders used dry stone masonry. Individual limestone blocks were placed against one another, their shapes and weight creating stability. This method required careful selection. A poorly positioned stone could weaken the surrounding wall, while a well-fitted block could lock several pieces together. The builders therefore had to understand the natural properties of the limestone and how individual stones interacted under pressure. The fortress also had to withstand an unusually demanding environment. Okinawa lies in the path of powerful tropical storms and typhoons. Heavy rainfall, strong winds, and moisture can rapidly damage poorly constructed structures. Yet sections of Tamagusuku's stonework have survived for centuries. That survival is not evidence that the walls were untouched. They have been damaged, repaired, and altered over time. But the persistence of the underlying stonework demonstrates how durable carefully constructed dry masonry can be. The limestone itself came from the surrounding geological landscape. Okinawa contains extensive limestone formations, and ancient builders made extensive use of this locally available material. Instead of transporting stone from distant regions, they could work with the rock beneath their own landscape. Imagine approaching Tamagusuku centuries ago. The fortress would have appeared above the surrounding countryside, its stone walls following the irregular contours of the hill. A narrow entrance would control movement into the interior, while the elevated position provided views across the surrounding terrain. The natural landscape and architecture worked together. The builders did not attempt to create a perfectly symmetrical fortress. They adapted the walls to the shape of the limestone ridge, using cliffs and slopes as additional defensive barriers. This is common in fortress construction around the world, but Tamagusuku demonstrates the principle particularly clearly. The strongest part of the defense was sometimes not the wall, it was the mountain beneath it. The history of Tamagusuku is connected with the period when the Ryukyu Islands were divided among competing political powers. Local rulers controlled territories, built fortified centres, and developed networks of influence across the islands. Gusuku became important symbols of this emerging political order. Tamagusuku is traditionally associated with Tamagusuku Aji, a powerful figure connected with the early history of the fortress. However, the historical traditions surrounding individual rulers are difficult to separate completely from later legends. The archaeological remains provide a more reliable record of the site's long development. The fortress was not simply a military installation. Gusuku sites often contain sacred spaces known as yutaki, places associated with Ryukyuan religious traditions. At Tamagusuku, the relationship between the fortress and sacred landscape is particularly important. This means that the walls may have protected more than people and supplies. The site itself could have been considered spiritually significant. Political authority, defensive power, and religious tradition could exist within the same landscape. Over the centuries, the political importance of different Gusuku changed. New centers became powerful. Political alliances shifted, and the Ryukyu kingdom eventually became more centralized. Tamagusuku lost some of its original strategic importance, but the fortress remained part of the landscape. The walls continued to weather beneath the subtropical climate, while vegetation gradually spread across sections of the site. Some stones shifted, others collapsed, and the original structure became increasingly fragmented. Modern archaeological and conservation work has helped preserve what remains. The surviving walls provide clues about construction techniques, the shape of the original fortress, and the way the builders adapted architecture to the limestone terrain. Yet many questions remain. How many people were stationed here? How frequently was the fortress occupied? Which sections were defensive, and which were connected with political or religious activities? The surviving stonework cannot answer every question. The absence of large inscriptions also makes the site more difficult to interpret. Unlike some ancient monuments, Tamagusuku does not provide a written record explaining every stage of its history. Much of what we know comes from archaeology, historical traditions, and comparisons with other Gusuku across Okinawa. The fortress also demonstrates how local building traditions developed according to the environment. The builders had access to limestone, a humid subtropical climate, and steep coastal terrain. Their architecture reflects all three. The walls are not monumental because they are enormous. They are remarkable because they have survived. Stone by stone, the builders created a structure that could absorb movement, drain water, and withstand the difficult conditions of the islands. Today, Tamagusuku's ruins stand quietly above the Okinawan landscape. The walls are weathered. The vegetation has reclaimed parts of the fortress, and only sections of the original complex remain. But the basic defensive layout is still visible. The Iron Age citadel of Hasanlu. In the mountains of northwestern Iran, the remains of an ancient city rise from the ground in layers. Massive walls, fortified gateways, storage rooms, and buildings that preserve evidence of a settlement destroyed with extraordinary violence. This is Hasanlu, an Iron Age citadel whose destruction left behind one of the most remarkable archaeological snapshots of the ancient Near East. Hasanlu was located near Lake Urmia, in a region where the Iranian plateau connected with the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Its position placed the settlement within a landscape of trade, competition, and shifting political powers. By the first millennium BC, Hasanlu had developed into a substantial fortified center. The settlement was protected by massive defensive walls, with towers and controlled entrances designed to restrict access. Inside the citadel, large buildings surrounded courtyards, storage areas held supplies, and workshops supported everyday life. This was not a small hilltop settlement. It was a major regional center. The most important archaeological layer is known as Hasanlu IV, the level associated with the destruction of the city around the late 9th century BC. The evidence suggests that the settlement was attacked, and much of it was burned. The destruction was so sudden that objects were left where people had used them. That makes Hasanlu unusually valuable. Archaeologists are often forced to reconstruct ancient life from scattered remains. But at Hasanlu, the destruction created something closer to a frozen moment. Rooms still contained vessels, tools, weapons, and personal objects. Among the most famous discoveries was a remarkable golden vessel, known as the Hasanlu Golden Bowl. It was found in the ruins of the citadel, and has become one of the most recognizable objects from Iron Age Iran. The bowl is made from gold, and its surface is decorated with carefully worked imagery. Figures, animals, and scenes involving chariots and supernatural or religious characters appear across its surface. The meaning of these scenes remains debated. The object is sometimes called a golden bowl, but its exact function is not completely certain. Was it a ceremonial vessel? A ritual object? A symbol of authority? Or something connected with elite burial or religious practice? The archaeological context provides clues, but not a definitive explanation. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, The thin sheet of gold was carefully shaped, then decorated with detailed imagery. The scenes are arranged into bands, creating a visual narrative around the vessel. Yet the story being told is difficult to reconstruct. Some figures appear to represent divine or supernatural beings, while others may be humans participating in ritual or ceremonial scenes. Chariots, animals, and symbols are combined into a complex composition, but without a written explanation, interpretations remain uncertain. The destruction layer provides another mystery. The golden bowl was not found carefully displayed in a ceremonial room. It was recovered from the ruins of the citadel, among the debris created during the destruction. That raises questions about what happened to it during the attack. Was it being carried away? Had it been hidden? Was it stored with other valuables? Or did its owner simply abandon it during the chaos? The archaeological evidence cannot tell us exactly what happened in those final moments. The destruction of Hassanlu was violent. Human remains were discovered among the ruins, along with weapons and evidence of burning. Some people appear to have died inside buildings, while others may have been killed during the attack. The destruction was extensive enough to bring the settlement's occupation to an abrupt end. Imagine the city before that moment. The citadel would have been active, people moving through courtyards, workers producing goods, animals passing through the settlement, and merchants bringing materials from surrounding regions. Then, an attack changed everything. Fire spread through the buildings, roofs collapsed, walls fell, and objects were buried beneath the destruction. The same event that ended the settlement also preserved an extraordinary amount of information about its final days. Hassanlu's location helps explain why the city mattered. The region around Lake Urmia was contested by powerful states and local kingdoms. The settlement stood within a wider political world involving Urartu, Assyria, and other regional powers. But the exact identity of Hassanlu's rulers remains debated. This uncertainty is important. Archaeologists can identify cultural connections through architecture, artifacts, and styles. But assigning Hassanlu to a single known kingdom is not always possible. The settlement may have belonged to a local political entity operating between larger powers. The citadel itself reveals considerable organization. Massive construction projects required labor. Stone and mud brick had to be prepared. Buildings had to be planned, and supplies had to be stored. The community behind Hassanlu was clearly capable of coordinating large-scale activity. The objects found within the ruins also reveal everyday life. Ceramics, metal tools, weapons, jewelry, and household objects survived in remarkable quantities. Together, they show a society that was far more complex than the destruction layer alone might suggest. But the Golden Bowl remains the most famous object. Its imagery has been studied for decades, and scholars have proposed different interpretations of its scenes. Some see connections with religious traditions of the ancient Near East, while others emphasize local artistic traditions. There is still no universally accepted reading of the entire composition. That uncertainty gives the bowl its lasting fascination. It is an object created by people who understood exactly what its images meant, but today, we can only interpret them from the surviving evidence. Their visual language survived. Their explanation did not. After the destruction, Hassanlu was never restored to its former importance. The ruined citadel remained buried, while political and economic centers shifted elsewhere. The ancient settlement slowly disappeared beneath the earth. Modern archaeological excavations began revealing the site in the 20th century. Layer by layer, researchers uncovered the buildings, the destruction debris, and thousands of objects. The Golden Bowl emerged as one of the most extraordinary discoveries. The massive mud brick temple of Kerma. Kerma developed in the Nile Valley of what is now northern Sudan. During the 2nd millennium BC, the settlement became the center of the Kingdom of Kerma, a powerful Nubian state that controlled an important stretch of the Nile. At its height, Kerma was one of the major centers of the ancient Nile Valley. The western Defufa dominates the archaeological site. Built almost entirely from mud brick, the structure originally stood around 18 meters high, although parts of the monument have been lost over thousands of years. Its enormous rectangular mass makes it unlike most surviving ancient buildings in the region. The word Defufa is commonly used for large mud brick structures associated with ancient Kerma. There are two major examples at the site: the western Defufa and the smaller eastern Defufa. The western structure is by far the more imposing. The construction itself is remarkable. Mud was mixed, formed into bricks, and then laid in enormous quantities. The builders created thick walls capable of supporting the structure above. Layer after layer, the monument gradually rose over the settlement. Mud brick might appear fragile, but in the dry climate of the Nile Valley, it can survive for thousands of years when properly protected. The same environment that can destroy exposed mud brick through occasional weathering can also preserve enormous sections when the structure is maintained and buried. The purpose of the Western Defufa remains debated. It was clearly important, but archaeologists have not reached complete agreement about exactly how every part of the structure functioned. It may have had religious or ceremonial functions, and its position within the wider Kerma settlement suggests that it was part of a much larger sacred and political landscape. The structure contains internal spaces, passages, and elevated areas. Its unusual design does not resemble a conventional Egyptian temple. Instead, it reflects architectural traditions that developed within Nubia itself. This distinction matters. Kerma was influenced by its relationship with Egypt, but it was not simply an Egyptian settlement. The kingdom developed its own political institutions, artistic traditions, burial practices, and monumental architecture. The Defufa is one of the clearest examples. Its massive mud brick form demonstrates that Kerma's builders were capable of monumental construction on a scale comparable with major centers elsewhere in the ancient Nile Valley. Imagine approaching Kerma during its period of power. The Nile would have supported agriculture. Boats would have moved along the river, and the settlement would have contained workshops, houses, storage areas, and ceremonial buildings. Above them, the huge Defufa would have dominated the skyline. The kingdom's position was extremely important. Kerma stood between Central Africa and Egypt, along one of the most important corridors in the Nile Valley. Goods could travel north and south, including livestock, gold, stone, ivory, ebony, and other valuable materials. This trade helped make Kerma wealthy. The rulers could use that wealth to support large construction projects, military forces, and an elaborate royal and religious culture. The archaeological evidence also shows that Kerma had a sophisticated burial tradition. Large tumuli were constructed for important individuals, some reaching enormous dimensions. These burial monuments demonstrate that monumental architecture extended beyond the city itself. The dead were placed within carefully organized funerary landscapes, surrounded by objects and offerings. This suggests that political authority and religious beliefs were closely connected. The Defufa belonged to that same world. Kerma also had a complicated relationship with Egypt. For centuries, Egyptian rulers attempted to control the northern reaches of Nubia. Fortresses were constructed along the Nile, trade routes were monitored, and military campaigns pushed southward. But Kerma was not easily controlled. Eventually, the balance of power changed. During the New Kingdom, Egypt conquered Kerma and incorporated much of Nubia into its expanding empire. The independent kingdom of Kerma disappeared, but its monumental remains survived. The Defufa was no longer the center of an independent kingdom, yet the structure remained part of the archaeological landscape. Later generations occupied the region, while the original political system vanished. The dry Nubian environment helped preserve the monument, but it also created challenges. Wind, sand, rain, and temperature changes gradually wear down exposed mud brick. Conservation, therefore, remains essential. Archaeologists have spent decades studying Kerma, excavating buildings, burials, pottery, tools, and monumental structures. Each discovery has helped reconstruct a civilization that was once overshadowed by the better-known history of ancient Egypt. The Western Defufa is particularly important because it changes that perspective. It demonstrates that monumental architecture in the ancient Nile Valley was not limited to Egypt. Farther south, Nubian communities were constructing enormous buildings of their own, and the choice of mud brick is significant. Stone monuments often dominate our image of ancient Africa, but mud brick could be equally monumental. Thousands upon thousands of individual bricks could be transformed into a massive architectural structure. The Defufa, therefore, represents more than an unusual building. It represents organization. The production of bricks, the movement of materials, the coordination of workers, and the maintenance of such a huge structure all required a powerful and organized society. The ancient settlements of Tikrit and Wallata. The settlements developed during the 2nd millennium BC. at a time when the climate of the Sahara was gradually becoming drier. People who had once depended heavily on lakes, rivers, and seasonal wetlands increasingly had to adapt to changing conditions. Instead of simply abandoning the region, some communities developed permanent or semi-permanent settlements. The most distinctive feature is the stone architecture. Walls were constructed from locally available stone, often forming circular or oval compounds. Individual settlements could contain numerous structures, creating dense clusters of stone-built habitation. This is important because the buildings were not temporary shelters. The effort required to gather stone, construct walls, and maintain compounds suggests that people were returning to the same places repeatedly. The settlements became permanent features of the landscape. Some sites contained carefully organized compounds, with narrow entrances, internal spaces, and walls arranged into distinctive patterns. The architecture varies between settlements, but the repeated use of stone demonstrates a shared building tradition across the region. The people living here also practiced agriculture. Archaeological evidence indicates the cultivation of crops such as millet, while livestock also played an important role. This combination allowed communities to survive as the surrounding climate became increasingly challenging. But the Sahara was not always as dry as it is today. During earlier periods, much of the region supported more vegetation. Lakes and seasonal waterways were more widespread, and human communities could move across landscapes that are now extremely arid. The Tichet-Walata settlements therefore preserve evidence of a major environmental transition. People were living through a period when the Sahara was gradually becoming drier, and their settlement patterns changed in response. Imagine approaching one of these settlements thousands of years ago. The surrounding land would have contained more vegetation than it does today. Fields could have been cultivated nearby. Animals moved across the landscape, and stone compounds formed organized communities. The settlements also reveal evidence of craft production. Pottery is especially important. Ceramic vessels found at the sites provide clues about cooking, storage, food preparation, and connections between different communities. Stone tools and other artifacts provide additional evidence of daily life. The people of Tichet and Walata were not simply surviving in a difficult environment. They were developing technologies and economic strategies suited to their surroundings. The architecture may also reveal something about social organization. Building substantial stone compounds requires cooperation, but the settlements do not look identical. Some structures are larger, some areas are more densely built, and different compounds may have served different purposes. This raises questions about inequality. Were some families more powerful than others? Did particular buildings belong to leaders? Or were the differences simply practical? The archaeological remains do not provide a simple answer. The settlements were also connected to a much wider West African landscape. People exchanged materials, moved between communities, and adapted to changing ecological conditions. The Tichet-Walata tradition was therefore not isolated. It formed part of a broader history of settlement across the Western Sahara and Sahel. As the climate continued to dry, the conditions that supported these communities became increasingly difficult. Water became less reliable, agriculture became more challenging, and people gradually moved toward areas with better access to water and pasture. The settlements were eventually abandoned. Stone walls remained, but vegetation changed. Soils shifted, and the communities that had built the compounds disappeared from the landscape. The desert and semi-desert environment then helped preserve the ruins. Because there was relatively little later construction across many of these areas, ancient walls remained visible above the ground. For archaeologists, this provides an unusual opportunity. The settlements preserve not only individual objects, but entire communities. Walls, compounds, paths, and surrounding landscapes can be studied together. That wider context is essential. A pottery vessel can tell us about technology. A stone tool can reveal an activity, but an entire settlement can reveal how people organize their lives. At Tichet and Walata, the architecture provides that larger picture. The sites also challenge older assumptions about the ancient Sahara. The desert was not always an empty barrier between civilizations. It was once home to communities capable of farming, keeping livestock, building substantial settlements, and adapting to major environmental changes. Tichet and Walata are remarkable because their stone walls preserve the story of communities that lived through the transformation of the Sahara. They built settlements, cultivated crops, raised animals, produced pottery, and organized their lives around a landscape that was gradually becoming drier. Eventually, the environment changed enough that these settlements could no longer support the communities that created them. The people moved on, but the stones remained. Across the dry landscape of Mauritania, the abandoned compounds still mark the places where ancient West African communities once lived, leaving behind one of the clearest archaeological records of early settled life in the Sahara. The Swahili ruins of Songo Manara, off the coast of Tanzania, on a small island surrounded by the waters of the Indian Ocean. The remains of an ancient stone-built town still stand among trees and coral. Collapsed walls, large houses, open courtyards, and mosques built from coral stone reveal a community that once belonged to one of Africa's great maritime trading cultures. This is Songo Manara, one of the most important surviving Swahili settlements on the East African coast. Songo Manara lies within the Kilwa archipelago, not far from the famous ruins of Kilwa Kisiwani. The settlement flourished during the later medieval period, when Swahili coastal cities were deeply connected to trade across the Indian Ocean. Ships traveled between East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and other regions around the ocean. Songo Manara was part of that world. The town was built largely from coral rag, a local building material created from fossilized coral. When carefully shaped, coral stone could be used to construct substantial walls, mosques, houses, and other public buildings. The settlement contains several mosques, large stone houses, courtyards, and open spaces that reveal careful urban planning. This was not simply a collection of individual buildings. The town had an organized layout, with different structures occupying specific areas. The houses are particularly interesting. Some were built around internal courtyards, creating private spaces separated from the streets outside. Rooms could be arranged around these courtyards, providing areas for living, storage, and other household activities. The architecture reflects the distinctive culture of the medieval Swahili coast. These communities were African, but they were also deeply connected to the wider Indian Ocean. Trade brought foreign goods, ideas, religious traditions, and architectural influences into coastal settlements. Islam played an important role. Several mosques were constructed within Songo Manara, demonstrating the importance of Islam within Swahili society. But the town was not simply an imported foreign settlement. Its architecture developed from local traditions, using local materials, local building techniques, and the social structures of coastal communities. Imagine approaching Songo Manara during its period of prosperity. A sailing vessel would come toward the island, passing through the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. On land, the white and pale coral stone buildings would stand among vegetation. People would move through courtyards, merchants would handle goods, and boats would connect the settlement with other coastal towns. The island's position was important. The Swahili coast depended heavily on maritime trade, and settlements like Songo Manara were connected through a network of ports and islands. Goods could move north and south along the African coast, while ships crossed the ocean toward Arabia and India. Archaeological discoveries reveal evidence of these connections. Imported ceramics, glass beads, and other objects have been found at Swahili sites. These materials demonstrate that coastal communities were participating in long-distance trade networks. But trade was only one part of life. The people of Songo Manara also relied on the surrounding environment. Fishing, agriculture, animal resources, and local production supported the settlement. The town was therefore connected to both the ocean and the land. The coral architecture also tells us about local resources. The builders could obtain coral stone from the surrounding coastal environment, then shape it into blocks suitable for construction. Lime mortar was used to bind many of the walls, creating durable buildings suited to the tropical climate. Some structures were surprisingly elaborate. Large houses contained multiple rooms, courtyards, and carefully constructed entrances. Their size suggests differences in wealth and status within the community. This raises questions about the society itself. Who lived in the largest houses? Were they merchants, political leaders, religious figures, or members of wealthy families? The architecture provides clues, but it does not identify every occupant. The town also contains a large number of burial areas. Graves were integrated into the settlement landscape, showing that the dead remained physically connected with the community. The relationship between houses, mosques, and burial places provides a glimpse into how Swahili society organized both daily life and religious practice. Songo Manara was not occupied forever. Like many medieval trading settlements, its fortunes depended partly on wider economic and political networks. Changes in trade, regional competition, and shifting maritime routes eventually affected the town. By the later period, the settlement was abandoned. Buildings collapsed, roofs disappeared, and vegetation gradually spread across the ruins. The coral walls remained, but the community that had built them was gone. The abandonment also helped preserve the archaeological landscape. Unlike a continuously occupied city, Songo Menara was not completely rebuilt over the centuries. The ruins therefore provide an unusually clear picture of a medieval Swahili settlement. Today, the remains reveal an entire town rather than a single monument. Mosques, houses, courtyards, burial areas, and public spaces can still be studied together. This allows archaeologists to examine how people actually organize their urban environment. Songo Menara also helps correct an older misconception about African history. For a long time, the sophisticated architecture of the Swahili coast was sometimes wrongly attributed to foreign builders. Archaeology has demonstrated that Swahili communities themselves created these cities, while participating in a cosmopolitan world of Indian Ocean exchange. The result was a distinctive coastal civilization, African in its foundations, Islamic in important aspects of its culture, and deeply connected to the wider maritime world. The stone city hidden in the cloud forest, high in the mountains of northern Peru, beyond steep valleys and dense cloud forest, a remarkable stone settlement is hidden among the vegetation. Massive walls, circular structures, carefully arranged terraces, and intricate stone friezes decorated with geometric patterns. This is Grand Pajatan, one of the most unusual archaeological sites associated with the Chachapoya culture. The site lies deep within the rugged eastern slopes of the Andes, in an environment very different from the dry valleys farther west. Here, clouds frequently cover the mountains. Heavy vegetation grows across the slopes, and steep terrain makes movement difficult. For the people who built Grand Pajatan, the landscape itself became part of their world. The settlement was constructed from stone, but its architecture is unlike the enormous rectangular buildings commonly associated with other Andean civilizations. Many of the structures are circular, with carefully constructed walls following the contours of the mountain. Some buildings were raised above the surrounding terrain, creating platforms that provided level surfaces within the steep landscape. One of the most striking features is the decoration. Stone walls contain intricate geometric friezes, including repeated patterns and figures that appear almost abstract. The builders did not simply stack stones for shelter. They shaped the surfaces into carefully designed architectural decoration. The Chachapoya are sometimes described as the people of the clouds, a name connected with the high, mist-covered landscapes where many of their settlements were located. Their civilization developed across a large region of the northern Peruvian Andes, particularly in areas of steep mountains and deep valleys. Grand Pajatan reflects this relationship with the landscape. The settlement is not positioned on an easy open plain. It occupies a difficult mountainous environment, where every building had to work with the natural slope. Imagine approaching the site centuries ago. The journey would have been difficult. Dense vegetation, steep paths, deep ravines, and frequent mist would have surrounded the settlement. Then, through the forest, the stone structures would begin to appear. The isolation of the site is one reason it remained relatively unknown to the outside world for so long. Modern access is difficult, and the surrounding terrain is extremely rugged. Even today, reaching Grand Pajatan requires careful planning. The architecture suggests that the settlement was more than a collection of houses. Large circular structures, raised platforms, stairways, and decorated walls indicate organized construction. Different areas may have served residential, ceremonial, or communal functions. The exact purpose of every building remains uncertain. Archaeologists can identify architectural patterns, but they cannot always determine how individual spaces were used. A circular structure could have served several purposes during its history, especially if the settlement was occupied and modified over generations. The decoration provides another clue to the cultural identity of the site. Geometric motifs repeat across the architecture, creating a visual language that appears throughout Chachapoya monumental construction. The patterns were not accidental. They were carefully incorporated into the stonework. Some of the structures also contain representations resembling human figures. These designs are difficult to interpret today. They may have had symbolic or ceremonial meanings, But the original beliefs of the builders were not recorded in a surviving written explanation. The surrounding environment may have influenced the architecture in other ways. Rainfall is heavy in the cloud forest, so water management would have been important. Buildings had to withstand moisture, while terraces and paths needed to cope with steep slopes and erosion. Stone construction provided durability. The builders used locally available rock, creating walls capable of surviving within the demanding mountain environment. But the forest has also become one of the site's greatest threats. Vegetation can grow directly across ancient walls. Roots can enter gaps between stones, and moisture gradually weakens exposed surfaces. Grand Pajaten therefore requires careful preservation. The same forest that helped hide the settlement for centuries can also damage the architecture. Conservation teams must balance archaeological protection with the fragile natural environment surrounding the site. The Chachapoya world was larger than Grand Pajaten. Other settlements across northern Peru contain circular buildings, terraces, fortifications, and elaborate burial structures. Together, they reveal a distinctive mountain civilization that developed independently before coming under the influence of the expanding Inca Empire. Eventually, the Chachapoya territories were incorporated into the Inca world. The process appears to have involved both conflict and political integration. But Grand Pajaten represents an earlier phase of the region's history, when Chachapoya communities controlled their own mountain landscapes. The site was eventually abandoned, and the forest gradually reclaimed it. Trees grew around the buildings. Moss covered the stones, and the settlement became increasingly difficult to distinguish from the surrounding mountains. Modern archaeological investigations brought the site to wider attention during the 20th century. Researchers documented the architecture, mapped the structures, and studied the distinctive decorative patterns. But access remained difficult, and extensive excavation has been limited. This means that much of Grand Pajaten is still waiting to be understood. The buildings survive, the friezes survive, and the surrounding landscape survives. But the daily lives of the people who built the settlement remain much less visible. Who lived in the largest circular structures? Which buildings were used for ceremonies? How was food produced in such a steep environment? And why was this particular location chosen? Gunung Padang, the megalithic hill of Indonesia. In the highlands of western Java, a long stone staircase climbs through thick vegetation toward the top of a quiet mountain ridge. At first, the site does not look like a city. There are no enormous temples, no towering statues, and no surviving inscriptions explaining who built it. Instead, there are terraces, stone walls, standing stones, and countless ancient blocks arranged across the hillside. This is Gunung Padang, one of Indonesia's most unusual megalithic archaeological sites. Gunung Padang is located in West Java, on the slopes of a volcanic landscape surrounded by mountains and dense vegetation. The site sits at an elevation of more than 1,000 meters, and its position gives it a commanding view across the surrounding countryside. The journey to the summit begins with a long stone staircase, leading upward through the forest. At the top, the landscape changes. 5 main terraces occupy the summit area, each separated by walls and approached through stone steps. The terraces are irregular, following the natural shape of the hill rather than forming a perfectly symmetrical complex. The stones are particularly distinctive. Many are long, angular, and roughly columnar in shape. They are made primarily from andesite, a volcanic rock abundant in the region. Some stones appear to have been arranged into walls, while others stand individually across the terraces. The exact age of the monument remains an important archaeological question. Gunung Padang is generally associated with Indonesia's prehistoric megalithic traditions, but different studies have proposed very different dates for activity beneath the site. Some of the more extreme claims have suggested that parts of the hill could be tens of thousands of years old. Those claims remain highly controversial and are not accepted as established archaeological fact. What can be seen on the surface is much more certain. The terraces, stone arrangements, and stairways clearly represent deliberate human modification of the hill. People transformed the natural summit into a series of structured spaces. The builders were also working with an unusual material. The andesite columns naturally fracture into long, angular pieces, creating stones that can be stacked and arranged without extensive carving. Instead of shaping every block into a perfect rectangle, the builders could take advantage of the natural form of the volcanic rock, This does not make the construction simple. Large stones still had to be moved, positioned, and arranged across the terraces. The builders had to understand the slope, the weight of the stones, and the stability of the walls. Imagine standing on the summit centuries ago. The surrounding forest would stretch across the mountains, while the terraces formed a cleared and organized space above it. Stone columns would line pathways, walls would separate different levels, and people would gather on the elevated platforms. The site's purpose remains uncertain. Some researchers interpret Gunung Padang primarily as a megalithic ceremonial or ritual complex. Its elevated position, terraced layout, and unusual stone arrangements suggest that activities beyond ordinary settlement may have taken place here. But the evidence does not reveal exactly what those activities were. There are no inscriptions describing ceremonies, no written records identify the builders, and very few artifacts provide a complete explanation of the site's function. The stones, therefore, have to speak for themselves. The terraces also appear to have been modified over time. Different construction phases may be represented in different parts of the site, suggesting that the hill remained important across generations. The monument may have been repaired, expanded, or reorganized by later communities. This is common with ancient sacred landscapes. A place can remain important long after the people who originally created it have disappeared. Later generations inherit the landscape, add their own structures, and sometimes reinterpret the meaning of older monuments. Gunung Padang's location may have contributed to its importance. The site stands within a landscape shaped by volcanic activity, with mountains and valleys surrounding the hill. Its elevated position creates a strong visual connection with the natural environment. The relationship between the monument and the landscape is therefore difficult to ignore. The builders did not simply place stones on flat ground. They transformed the summit of a natural hill, turning an existing geological feature into a monumental space. Modern research has produced intense debate about what lies beneath the visible terraces. Geophysical surveys and archaeological investigations have suggested that additional buried structures or stone arrangements may exist below the surface. But interpreting these layers is difficult. Natural volcanic formations can sometimes resemble human construction, and distinguishing natural geology from archaeological remains requires careful excavation. This is where Gunung Padang becomes especially interesting. The visible monument is real, but the deeper claims surrounding the hill remain a subject of continuing investigation. Archaeology has not established that the entire mountain is an artificial structure, nor has it demonstrated the existence of an extremely ancient lost civilization beneath it. What is certain is already remarkable. People repeatedly came to this volcanic hill, transported and arranged stone, built terraces, and created a monumental landscape that survived for centuries. Eventually, the original communities disappeared. The terraces became surrounded by vegetation, and the site entered a much quieter phase of its history. Local communities continued to know the area. The rock fortress of Yapahua. In the dry hills of northwestern Sri Lanka, a massive granite rock rises above the surrounding landscape. Stone walls once climbed its slopes, a fortified settlement occupied its summit, and a monumental staircase leads upward toward the remains of an ancient royal center. This is Yapahua, a medieval rock fortress that briefly became one of the most important political centers in Sri Lanka. Yapahua is built around a dramatic natural rock formation, rising high above the surrounding plain. The location gave the fortress an immediate defensive advantage. Anyone approaching the settlement would have to cross the open landscape below, then climb toward the rocky stronghold. The height made the site difficult to attack, but the builders went further. They transformed the natural rock into a fortified complex. Stone walls were constructed around the lower areas, while defensive structures occupied the upper slopes. The settlement was divided into different levels, creating a combination of natural and artificial defenses. The rock itself became the foundation of the fortress, but the most impressive feature is the enormous stairway. A long flight of stone steps climbs toward the upper part of the fortress, passing through an elaborate architectural entrance. The staircase is not simply functional. Its decoration and position suggest that reaching the upper complex was intended to be an important experience. At the top, the remains of the former royal center can still be found. The fortress became particularly important during the reign of King Bhuvanekabahu I, who ruled in the late 13th century. At a time when Sri Lanka was facing political instability, Yapahua became a temporary capital. The decision to establish the capital here was closely connected with security. The The kingdom was under pressure from external enemies, and the island's political centers had shifted repeatedly. A fortified mountain stronghold offered protection. Yapahua provided both a defensive position and a place from which the kingdom could be governed. The fortress, therefore, had two identities. It was a military stronghold, but it was also a royal residence. Palace buildings, religious structures, defensive walls, and ceremonial spaces all occupied the same landscape. Imagine entering Yapahua during its period of royal importance. The journey upward would begin below the rock, then continue through fortified areas, before reaching the enormous decorated staircase. At the upper entrance, the architecture would have created a dramatic transition into the royal complex. The staircase contains some of the most detailed surviving stone carving at Yapahua. Decorative figures, animals, floral patterns, and architectural details were carved into the stone. The builders transformed what could have been a simple defensive stairway into a monumental entrance. The relationship between defense and ceremony is important. A fortress needs to control movement, but a royal capital also needs to impress. At Yapahua, the same staircase served both purposes. It controlled access to the upper complex, while displaying the wealth and authority of the rulers who built it. The site also became associated with one of Sri Lanka's most important Buddhist relics. During this period, the sacred tooth relic of the Buddha was brought to Yapahua. The relic held enormous religious and political significance. Possession of it was closely connected with royal authority. The arrival of the relic transformed Yapahua's importance. The fortress was no longer simply a secure royal residence. It became a major religious and political center. The sacred relic was housed within a specially protected environment, surrounded by architecture designed to emphasize its importance. This connection between kingship and religion was central to medieval Sri Lankan politics. A ruler's authority was not purely military. Protecting and controlling important Buddhist relics strengthened the legitimacy of the monarchy. Yapahua therefore became a symbol of both political power and religious protection. But its period as the capital was relatively short. Political circumstances changed, and the sacred tooth relic was eventually removed from Yapahua. The royal center lost much of its importance. Later, the fortress was no longer the main political center of the kingdom. Buildings deteriorated, the settlement became quieter, and vegetation gradually spread across the ruins. The enormous staircase remained. The natural rock also helped preserve the site. The granite foundation could survive centuries of weathering, while the surrounding landscape limited large-scale later construction. Even after the political center disappeared, the basic form of the fortress remained visible. Yapahua is also important because it demonstrates the sophistication of medieval Sri Lankan architecture. The builders understood how to combine natural geography with constructed defenses, how to move people through controlled spaces, and how to turn a difficult mountain environment into a royal center. The fortress was not built by simply placing walls around the rock. The architecture follows the terrain: paths, walls, stairways, and buildings were positioned according to the natural shape of the mountain. This approach made the fortress difficult to attack. An invading army could not simply surround the entire settlement on level ground. The steep rock restricted movement, while the walls created additional barriers. But the site also reveals the limitations of fortress architecture. No stronghold is completely isolated from the political world around it. Yapahua's importance depended on the survival of the kingdom that controlled it. When political power shifted, the fortress lost its central role. Today, the lower and upper areas of Yapahua preserve fragments of this history. Walls survive along the slopes. Stone foundations mark former buildings, and the monumental staircase still climbs toward the summit. The staircase may be the clearest surviving expression of the site's former importance. It was designed to make people climb, slowly approaching the royal complex above. The effort involved in reaching the top was itself part of the architecture, and that makes Yapahua different from a simple military fort. It was a carefully controlled journey through space. Defensive walls, stone steps, carved figures, and the elevated royal center all worked together. The ancient dockyard of Lothal. Along the edge of the ancient Indus world, in what is now Gujarat, India, the remains of a carefully planned city lie beneath the dry landscape. Straight streets, brick-built structures, drainage channels, workshops, and beside the settlement, a massive basin that has long been identified as an ancient dockyard. This is Lothal, one of the most important archaeological sites of the Indus Valley civilization. Lothal was established during the 3rd millennium BC, at a time when cities were developing across the Indus region. Unlike many famous Indus settlements farther north, Lothal was located close to the Gulf of Khambat. Its position gave the settlement access to waterways connecting the interior with the Arabian Sea. That location appears to have played an important role in the city's development. The settlement was carefully planned. Buildings were constructed using standardized bricks. Streets followed organized layouts, and drainage systems carried water away from inhabited areas. This level of planning was characteristic of many Indus cities. But Lothal had another feature that made it especially unusual: a large rectangular basin connected with the settlement. The structure has traditionally been interpreted as a dockyard, a place where boats could enter, load and unload goods, and remain protected from changing water conditions. If that interpretation is correct, Lothal provides evidence of sophisticated maritime engineering during the Bronze Age. The basin itself is enormous compared with many other structures at the site. Its walls were constructed from carefully laid bricks, creating a controlled enclosure for water. The builders had to consider the surrounding waterways, the movement of water, and the changing levels of the nearby tidal environment. This is where Lothal becomes particularly interesting. A dock is useful only if water can reach it. The ancient settlement, therefore, required some understanding of local hydrology. Channels and waterways connected the settlement with the broader landscape, allowing water to move between the basin and surrounding areas. The exact functioning of the dock remains debated. Some researchers have questioned whether the basin was primarily a dock, or whether parts of it could have served other hydraulic purposes. The archaeology does not preserve an ancient manual explaining how the system worked, but the structure was clearly engineered to manage water. Imagine Lothal during its period of prosperity. The city would have been surrounded by a very different landscape, with waterways crossing the region, agricultural areas surrounding the settlement, and boats moving along routes toward the coast. Within the city, workers would have produced goods for local use and exchange. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of craft production at Lothal: beads, shell objects, pottery, metalworking remains, and other manufactured goods reveal a community with specialized skills. The settlement was not simply a farming village. It participated in a wider economic system. Trade appears to have been especially important. Objects and materials connected with the wider Indus civilization have been found at the site, while evidence suggests contact with regions beyond the Indus world. The Arabian Sea provided a natural route toward distant coastal communities. The city's location, therefore, offered an important advantage. Goods produced inland could move toward the coast, while materials arriving by sea could travel into the interior. Lothal could function as a link between different economic regions. The standardized brick construction is another important feature. Indus builders frequently used bricks with consistent proportions, allowing structures to be constructed efficiently. At Lothal, this standardization appears in walls, drainage structures, platforms, and other architectural features. The drainage system is particularly impressive. Channels were incorporated into the city, helping control wastewater and surface water. Some were constructed beneath or alongside buildings, creating infrastructure that was largely hidden from view. This reveals an important characteristic of Indus urbanism. The people who built Lothal were not only interested in monumental structures, they invested in the systems that allowed an urban population to function. Water, waste, storage, transportation, and manufacturing all had to work together. The settlement also contained areas associated with administration and storage. Large structures may have been used to hold goods, while raised platforms provided protection from water. The exact function of individual buildings remains debated, but their arrangement suggests careful organization. Lothal was not isolated from the wider Indus world. Its architecture, pottery, weights, beads, and other artifacts show strong connections with distant Indus settlements. This suggests that ideas and standards traveled across large distances. The discovery of standardized weights is particularly significant. Weights were used to measure goods, and their consistent forms suggest that commercial activity was regulated. A city involved in long-distance trade needed reliable systems for measuring and exchanging materials. The settlement eventually faced major environmental changes. Flooding appears to have affected Lothal at different points in its history, and the relationship between the city and surrounding waterways changed over time. The same water system that helped the settlement prosper could also become a threat. Eventually, Lothal declined. The wider Indus civilization also underwent major transformations, with many urban centers shrinking or changing during the second millennium BC. Trade networks were reorganized, settlement patterns shifted, and the Great Bronze Age cities entered a different phase. Lothal was gradually abandoned, buildings deteriorated, and sediment covered parts of the ancient settlement. The dockyard disappeared beneath the ground, waiting thousands of years before archaeologists uncovered it. Modern excavations revealed the remarkable scale of the site. Brick walls, streets, drainage channels, workshops, and the huge water basin emerged from the archaeological layers. Together, they revealed a city that had been deeply connected to water and trade. Today, Lothal is one of the best-known archaeological sites associated with the Indus Valley Civilization in India. Its importance lies not only in the dockyard, but in the entire urban system surrounding it. The city demonstrates how closely engineering and commerce could be connected. A settlement near the coast needed to manage water, move goods, protect buildings, and maintain reliable routes between the interior and the sea. The rock-cut tombs of Matala. Along the southern coast of Crete, a steep sandstone cliff rises directly above the Mediterranean. Its face is covered with openings, small chambers, narrow passages, and dozens of caves cut into the rock. This is Matala, a coastal landscape where ancient people carved tombs directly into the cliffs. And unlike many famous ancient burial sites, these chambers contain very little written evidence explaining who created them or exactly how they were used. The caves overlook Matala Bay, a natural harbor on the southern coast of Crete. The location was important for communities connected to the sea, and the sheltered coastline made Matala a useful stopping point for people traveling along the southern Mediterranean. But the caves themselves were created for a very different purpose. Many were used as burial chambers during the Roman period and later antiquity. Instead of constructing elaborate stone tombs, people carved directly into the soft rock of the cliff. The sandstone was comparatively workable, allowing chambers to be excavated using hand tools. Walls could be shaped, ceilings cut into curves, and small rooms connected through narrow openings. The result is an unusual underground cemetery. From the beach, the caves appear almost like natural openings in the cliff, but many contain clear evidence of human modification. Straightened walls, regular niches, cut entrances, and deliberately shaped chambers reveal that the rock was repeatedly transformed. Some of the caves are relatively simple. Others contain several connected spaces, creating small underground complexes. The differences may reflect different periods of use, different burial practices, or simply the needs of individual groups. The exact history of the caves is complicated. Matala was occupied during several periods, and the rock-cut chambers were reused and modified over time. The site, therefore, does not represent one single cemetery created during one brief period. Instead, it preserves layers of human activity across centuries. This raises an important archaeological problem. When a chamber was reused, its original purpose could become difficult to determine. Later occupants could alter the walls, move earlier remains, or introduce new objects. The cave then becomes a record of several different generations. The Roman period is particularly important. During Roman rule, Crete was connected to a much larger Mediterranean political and economic system. Ports and coastal settlements became part of networks extending across the eastern Mediterranean. Matala's position on the southern coast placed it within this wider maritime landscape. But the caves were not necessarily reserved exclusively for one type of burial. Some chambers appear to have had different uses at different times. The archaeological evidence suggests that the site evolved, rather than following one fixed plan. Imagine approaching Matala during antiquity. The bay would have been visible below. Ships or small boats could have approached the coast, and the cliff would have been covered with openings. Some were burial chambers. Others may have served different purposes at different periods. The surrounding landscape also contains evidence of earlier activity. Matala had importance before the Roman period, and the coastline was connected with the ancient settlement of Kamos located nearby. This means the caves existed within a much older human landscape. The sea was central to that landscape. Crete sits between several important regions of the eastern Mediterranean, and its position made maritime movement possible in many directions. People, goods, religious practices, and burial traditions could all travel along these routes. Yet the Matala caves are surprisingly quiet about the identities of the people who used them. There are no long inscriptions describing the individuals buried inside, no surviving archive explaining the cemetery, and no clear written account telling us how the chambers were organized. The rock preserves the spaces, but not the voices of their occupants. That makes the archaeology particularly important. Researchers must study the architecture, human remains, burial practices, artifacts, and the relationship between the caves and the surrounding settlement. Each piece provides only part of the story. The absence of inscriptions does not mean that the caves were unimportant, quite the opposite. The effort required to carve burial chambers into a cliff suggests that these spaces held lasting significance. The dead were placed in a landscape that could be seen from the sea, and remembered through a permanent architectural feature. The caves may also have changed meaning over time. A burial chamber created during one period could later become a shelter, a storage space, or a place for another activity. Ancient landscapes were rarely static. People reused what earlier generations had built. This is particularly visible at Matala. Different chambers show different forms, different degrees of modification, and different relationships with the surrounding cliff. Some appear carefully planned, while others seem to have developed gradually. The rock itself also helped preserve the site. Unlike wooden structures, the excavated chambers could survive for centuries. Weathering affected the cliff, but many of the interiors remained recognizable. Eventually, the ancient communities that used the caves disappeared. The Roman world changed. Later Byzantine and medieval societies developed, and Matala's original burial traditions faded. But the chambers remained cut into the cliff. Centuries later, the caves attracted new occupants for completely different reasons. In the 20th century, Matala became associated with the international counterculture of the 1960s and 1970s. Modern visitors occupied some of the ancient caves, giving the site an entirely new chapter in its long history. That modern history is fascinating, but it should not obscure the much older archaeological record. Long before modern travelers arrived, the caves had already been used by people who carved spaces for their dead into the Mediterranean cliff. The Amazon cities of Upano Valley, deep beneath the forests of eastern Ecuador, a landscape that once appeared almost untouched is revealing the remains of something far more complex. Straight roads, raised platforms, large settlements, and networks of ancient earthworks hidden beneath the dense Amazonian vegetation. This is the Upano Valley, a region where archaeologists have discovered evidence of ancient urban settlements that transformed the rainforest landscape. For centuries, the Amazon was often imagined as a wilderness containing only small, scattered communities. But the discoveries in the Upano Valley tell a different story. Beneath the forest, ancient people constructed organized settlements connected by roads and carefully planned earthworks. The scale became much clearer through LIDAR technology. Instead of relying only on what can be seen from the ground, LIDAR can reveal the shape of the landscape beneath the forest canopy. Trees disappear from the digital model, and the ancient structures begin to emerge. What appeared were patterns that are extremely difficult to explain as natural formations. Rectangular platforms, large plazas, straight roads, and clusters of settlements connected across the valley. The forest had hidden an entire human landscape. Some of the settlements were arranged in organized patterns, with raised platforms positioned around open spaces. These areas may have served residential, ceremonial, or communal purposes. The exact function of every structure remains uncertain, but their deliberate construction is clear. The roads are perhaps even more remarkable. Instead of following every natural curve of the landscape, some ancient routes run remarkably straight. They connect different parts of the settlement system, creating a network across the valley. Building such roads in a rainforest environment would have required considerable effort. Vegetation had to be cleared, ground surfaces prepared, and routes maintained over time. The roads therefore reveal more than transportation. They demonstrate organization. Imagine the Upano Valley more than 1,000 years ago. The forest would still surround the settlements, but the landscape would have been filled with activity. People moving along raised routes, working around large platforms, growing and gathering food, and traveling between neighboring communities. The people who built these settlements belonged to ancient societies that developed within the Amazonian environment. They were not simply destroying the forest to create cities. They were adapting the landscape to their needs. Evidence from the valley suggests that people modified their environment in several ways, creating agricultural areas, managing vegetation, and constructing settlements that could support larger populations. The forest and the city were therefore closely connected. The discoveries also challenge another common assumption. Urbanism does not always require enormous stone buildings. In the Upano Valley, people used earth. They shaped soil, raised platforms, created roads, and transformed the ground itself into architecture. This kind of construction can disappear remarkably easily. Wood decays, vegetation returns, and earthworks can become almost invisible beneath centuries of forest growth. Without LiDAR, much of this landscape might have remained hidden. The archaeological evidence also suggests that the settlements were not isolated. Roads connected different centers, creating a broader regional network. This raises important questions about how the communities interacted. Were they politically united? Did they share religious traditions? Or were they independent settlements connected through trade and cooperation? The evidence does not yet provide a complete answer. What is clear is that the landscape was carefully organized. The placement of platforms, the alignment of roads, and the repeated patterns across different settlements all point toward planning. These were not random clusters of houses. The settlements also existed for generations. People modified older structures, added new platforms, and changed the organization of their communities. The archaeological landscape, therefore, represents a long history of occupation rather than a single moment. Eventually, the settlements declined. The reasons remain uncertain. Environmental changes, political transformations, changes in population, or shifts in economic networks may all have played a role. But over time, the forest reclaimed much of the built landscape. Trees grew across the ancient roads, roots entered the earthworks, and the settlements became almost invisible from ground level. The Amazon did what it does best. It covered the evidence. Then modern technology changed the picture. LiDAR surveys revealed the hidden geometry beneath the canopy, allowing archaeologists to see the valley from an entirely different perspective. What looked like natural forest contained the outlines of an ancient civilization. The discoveries have transformed our understanding of the Amazon. The rainforest was not simply a place where people lived without significantly modifying their surroundings. In some regions, ancient communities created large settlements, connected them with roads, and engineered the landscape on a regional scale. But the story is still being investigated. Every newly mapped structure raises another question. How many people lived here? How were the settlements governed? What did the roads connect? And what happened to the communities that eventually left them behind? The Upano Valley is remarkable because an ancient urban landscape survived almost completely hidden beneath the Amazon forest. The roads remained, the platforms remained, and the settlement patterns remained. But vegetation concealed them for centuries. Only when researchers looked beneath the forest canopy with LiDAR did the larger picture become visible. An organized network of ancient communities, built from earth, connected by roads, and adapted to one of the most challenging environments on Earth. Today, the forest still covers much of the valley. But beneath the trees, the remains of those ancient cities continue to reveal a forgotten chapter of Amazonian history. The buried city of Ahichatra. In the northern plains of India, beneath fields, villages, and layers of earth, the remains of an ancient city stretch across the landscape. Massive defensive walls, brick foundations, ancient pottery, and traces of streets and buildings reveal a settlement that survived through many centuries. This is Ahichatra, one of the important ancient urban centers of northern India. Ahichatra is located in what is now Uttar Pradesh, in the fertile landscape of the Ganges Plain. The region provided access to water, agricultural land, and routes connecting different parts of northern India. These advantages helped the settlement grow into a major center. The ancient city was surrounded by substantial fortifications. Large earthen and brick ramparts enclosed the settlement, creating a protected urban space. From outside, the defensive structures would have made the city appear like a massive raised landscape. But the walls are only part of the story. Archaeological excavations have revealed layers of occupation beneath the surface, showing that Ahichatra was not built and abandoned once. Different communities occupied the site, rebuilt structures, modified defenses, and left new layers over older ones. This is why the city can seem buried, Centuries of construction and natural accumulation gradually covered earlier buildings. A structure that once stood above the ground could eventually become hidden beneath later deposits. The modern landscape therefore conceals much of the ancient city. Archaeological evidence indicates that Ahichattra was occupied for a very long period, with important phases extending into the early historic period of northern India. Its history includes connections with major political and cultural developments across the Ganges Plain. The city was also associated with the Panchala region, an important political and cultural area of ancient northern India. Ahichattra is traditionally identified as the northern capital of Panchala, while Kampilia was associated with southern Panchala. This gave the settlement considerable political significance. Imagine Ahichattra during its period of prosperity. The fortified city would have contained houses, workshops, religious buildings, storage areas, and busy streets. People would have entered through controlled gateways, while merchants and craftsmen moved through the urban center. The archaeological remains reveal evidence of craft activity. Pottery, terracotta objects, metal artifacts, and other materials show that people produced and exchanged a wide range of goods. The city was therefore not simply a political center. It was also a place of everyday economic activity. Religious traditions also became increasingly important. Archaeologists have found evidence connected with different periods of Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain activity. This reflects the changing religious landscape of northern India. Different traditions could exist within the same urban region, sometimes across different periods of occupation. One of the most fascinating features of Ahichattra is therefore its long continuity. The city was repeatedly transformed. As political powers changed, religious traditions developed, and new architectural styles appeared. The archaeological mound became a record of these changes. The city also provides evidence of sophisticated brick construction. Brick was an essential building material across the Ganges Plain, where suitable stone was not always readily available. Ancient builders therefore developed highly effective techniques for constructing walls, platforms, drains, and monumental structures from brick. Over time, some of these structures disappeared beneath later layers. Rain, sediment, collapsed buildings, and new construction gradually raised the ground level. The ancient city became a buried landscape. This creates an unusual archaeological situation. What looks like an ordinary mound from the surface can contain centuries of urban history underneath. Excavation, therefore, becomes a process of moving downward through time. The deeper archaeologists go, the older the city becomes. A later structure may sit directly above an earlier one, while fragments of pottery and other objects help identify different periods. Each layer adds another chapter to Ahichattra's history. Eventually, the city declined in importance. Political centers shifted, trade routes changed, and the settlement gradually lost the significance it had once held. Buildings collapsed, the population decreased, and the ancient urban landscape became increasingly quiet. But the site was never completely erased. The massive fortifications remained as raised earthworks, while buried foundations continued to survive beneath the fields. Centuries later, archaeological investigation began revealing the scale of what had been hidden. Today, Ahichattra remains an important archaeological site for understanding the development of ancient northern Indian cities. Its importance is not based on one spectacular monument. Instead, it lies in the layers. Fortifications, buildings, artifacts, religious remains, and evidence of everyday life accumulated over centuries. Ahichattra is remarkable because an entire ancient city became buried beneath the landscape, but its history remained preserved underground. The walls tell us about defense, the artifacts reveal trade and craftsmanship, and the layers reveal generations of people who repeatedly rebuilt the city. We can uncover parts of their world, but much of Ahichattra still lies beneath the earth. Under fields and vegetation, the remains of an ancient northern Indian city continue to wait beneath the surface, preserving a history that stretches across centuries of changing kingdoms, communities, and traditions. The forgotten capital of Kaushambi. Along the banks of the Yamuna in northern India, the remains of an ancient city lie scattered beneath the landscape. Massive defensive walls, brick foundations, ancient streets, religious structures, and thousands of objects buried beneath centuries of soil. This is Kaushambi, one of the important urban centers of ancient northern India. Kaushambi was the capital of the ancient Vatsa kingdom, a powerful state that emerged in the Ganges-Yamuna region during the early historic period. Its location was especially important. The city stood close to the Yamuna, providing access to water, agricultural land, and routes connecting the Ganges plain with other parts of northern India. The city was heavily fortified. A massive defensive wall surrounded the settlement, constructed using earth and brick. From the outside, the fortifications would have created a formidable barrier around the urban center. But the walls also reveal something about the scale of Kaushambi. This was not a small settlement. It was a major political and economic center. Archaeological excavations have uncovered multiple layers of occupation, showing that Kaushambi developed and changed over long periods. Buildings were constructed, destroyed, rebuilt, and sometimes replaced by completely different structures. The city was constantly evolving. Imagine Kaushambi during its period of prosperity. The streets would have been filled with people, merchants transporting goods, craftsmen working in workshops, farmers bringing produce into the city, and officials moving between administrative areas. The Yamuna would have connected the city with wider networks of movement and trade. Kaushambi also became an important religious center. The city is strongly associated with the Buddhist tradition, and ancient sources describe the Buddha visiting Kaushambi. Monastic communities developed around the city, adding another layer to its political and economic importance. One of the most important archaeological remains is the Gosatarama Monastery, a Buddhist monastic complex associated with the ancient city. Its remains provide evidence of the religious life that developed alongside the urban settlement. But Kaushambi was not exclusively a religious center. Its archaeological record contains pottery, coins, tools, ornaments, and other objects associated with everyday urban life. These finds show that ordinary economic activity continued alongside political and religious institutions. The city's location also made it important for trade. Kaushambi was connected to routes extending across the northern Indian plains, allowing goods and ideas to move between different regions. This helped transform the city into a major center of commerce. The fortifications were repeatedly modified. As the city grew, the defensive system had to change. Walls were strengthened, new sections were added, and existing structures were repaired. The surviving ruins, therefore, represent several stages of construction rather than one single wall. The archaeological layers also reveal changing technologies. Different types of pottery, metal objects, coins, and building materials appear through different periods. Each layer records another stage in the city's long history. Kaushambi's history is closely connected with the changing political landscape of northern India. The Vatsa kingdom eventually became part of larger political systems. While powerful states such as Magadha expanded across the Ganges plain, the balance of power gradually shifted away from Kaushambi. The city did not disappear immediately. It continued to be occupied, but its political importance declined. Other centers became more powerful. Trade routes changed, and Kaushambi gradually lost the position it had once held. Eventually, the ancient city was largely abandoned. Buildings collapsed, walls eroded, and vegetation spread across the remains. Centuries of natural accumulation covered parts of the settlement. The former capital became an archaeological landscape. Modern excavations have slowly revealed what lies beneath. Archaeologists uncovered sections of the fortifications, residential areas, religious structures, industrial activity, and objects that help reconstruct daily life. The site is particularly valuable because it preserves more than monumental architecture. A palace can tell us about rulers, but pottery and tools can tell us about ordinary people. At Kaushambi, both stories survive together. The city also reminds us that ancient capitals were not simply places of political power. They were living environments. People had to obtain food, manage water, produce goods, build houses, maintain roads, and defend the settlement. Everyday infrastructure was just as important as royal authority. Today, much of ancient Kaushambi remains beneath the landscape. The surviving ruins may appear quiet, but beneath them are layers of a city that once connected politics, trade, religion, and everyday life. Kaushambi is remarkable because one of ancient India's important capitals became almost forgotten beneath the earth. Its massive fortifications still mark the outline of the ancient city, while monasteries and buried artifacts reveal its religious and economic importance. The Vatsa kingdom disappeared, political centers shifted, and Kaushambi eventually lost its former prominence. But the archaeological remains survived. Along the Yamuna, the ruins still preserve the story of an ancient capital, a city that once stood at the center of northern India's political and cultural world. The lost city of Kainua, in the northern Italian landscape, hidden beneath fields and quiet countryside. The remains of an ancient Etruscan city reveal a civilization that existed long before the rise of the Roman Empire. Stone foundations, straight streets, temple remains, and traces of carefully organized urban planning. This is Kainua, the ancient city at Marzabotto, one of the clearest archaeological examples of Etruscan city planning. Kainua was established during the 6th century BC, in a region that became an important center of Etruscan settlement. Unlike many ancient cities whose layouts were repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, Kainua preserves a remarkably clear urban plan. The streets were arranged in an organized grid, creating blocks of buildings across the settlement. The layout is immediately striking. Long roads cross the city, intersecting with other streets at controlled angles. Buildings were positioned within the spaces created by the road network, giving the settlement an unusually regular appearance. This tells us something important about the people who built it. Kainua was not simply a settlement that developed randomly over generations. Its urban landscape appears to have been planned from the beginning, with streets, plots, public spaces, and religious areas incorporated into the design. The Etruscans are often remembered through their relationship with Rome, but centuries before Rome dominated Italy, Etruscan communities had already developed sophisticated cities across central and northern Italy. Kainua provides a rare opportunity to see one of those cities in its physical form. The city contained residential areas, workshops, religious structures, and open spaces. Different activities could therefore take place within clearly organized parts of the settlement. One of the most important areas was the Acropolis, a raised zone containing major religious structures. Temples were positioned here, creating a sacred center within the larger urban landscape. The architecture reveals connections with wider Mediterranean traditions, but it also preserves distinctly Etruscan characteristics. The buildings were constructed using materials available locally, including stone foundations and clay-based architectural elements. Imagine walking through Kainua during its period of prosperity. The roads would have been busy. Workshops would have been producing goods. People would have moved between houses and public spaces, and temples would have stood above the city. Outside the settlement, the surrounding landscape connected Kainua with other Etruscan communities. The city's location was important for another reason. Kainua stood near the Reno River, providing access to routes through the surrounding region. The settlement could therefore participate in movement and exchange between different parts of northern Italy. Archaeological evidence also points toward craft production. Pottery, metal objects, and other materials reveal specialized activities within the city. These industries were part of the economic system that supported the settlement. The city was also connected to the wider Mediterranean world. Etruscan communities participated in long-distance exchange, receiving foreign goods while exporting their own products. Objects discovered at Kainua provide evidence of these wider connections. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the site is what happened after the city disappeared. Kainua was eventually abandoned, and unlike continuously occupied cities, it was not completely covered by later urban development. The ancient street plan therefore remained surprisingly well preserved. Over time, buildings collapsed, walls deteriorated, and vegetation covered the ruins. The city became almost invisible from the surface. But beneath the soil, the original urban grid survived. Modern archaeology gradually revealed the scale of the settlement. Excavations exposed streets, building foundations, temples, drainage features, and other elements of the ancient city. The result was an unusually detailed picture of Etruscan urban planning. The city also provides clues about Etruscan ideas of space. The separation between residential, commercial, and sacred areas suggests that urban planning was not purely practical. The organization of the city may also have reflected religious and social principles. This is especially visible in the relationship between the street grid and the sacred areas. The city was organized according to a broader concept of order, where human architecture and religious space were carefully positioned within the landscape. Eventually, the political world around Kainua changed. Rome expanded. Etruscan territories were gradually absorbed into Roman control, and independent Etruscan cities lost their political importance. Kainua was eventually abandoned. Its disappearance was gradual, but its preservation was extraordinary. The roads remained beneath the fields. The temple foundations survived, and the city plan was never completely erased. Today, visitors can walk along parts of the ancient streets, seeing the layout of the city almost as the original inhabitants would have experienced it. There are no towering buildings remaining, but the organization of the settlement is still visible. That is what makes Kainua so valuable. The ruins do not simply show us individual monuments. They reveal an entire city and how its inhabitants organize space. Kainua is remarkable because an Etruscan city that disappeared more than 2,000 years ago still preserves its carefully planned street network. The temples, the houses, the workshops, and the roads reveal a society capable of organizing an entire urban landscape according to a deliberate plan. Eventually, Rome's expansion transformed the political world of Italy, and Kainua fell silent. The buildings disappeared beneath the earth, but the streets remained. Today, the ancient grid of Kainua still survives at Marzabotto, a rare glimpse into an Etruscan city before Roman power transformed the Italian peninsula. The forgotten city of Gengeno. Gengeno developed roughly 2,000 years ago, within the fertile but constantly changing landscape of the Niger inland delta. The region is shaped by seasonal flooding, channels, wetlands, and islands of higher ground. For the people who settled here, water was both a resource and a challenge. The settlement grew on a raised area surrounded by waterways. This provided access to fishing, agriculture, animal resources, and transportation. Boats could move through the waterways of the delta, connecting communities that would have been difficult to reach across dry land. Gengeno is particularly important because it does not look like the conventional image of an ancient city. There was no enormous central palace dominating the settlement. Instead, the city appears to have developed as a collection of interconnected residential areas. Archaeologists have identified numerous compounds, separated by streets and open spaces. Different groups may have occupied different parts of the settlement, creating an urban landscape that was spread across a large area. This raises an important question. Who controlled the city? There is little evidence for a giant royal center comparable to the capitals of some other ancient civilizations. Instead, Gengeno may have been organized through networks of communities, specialists, traders, and local authorities. That possibility makes the site especially significant. It suggests that urban life does not always require a single powerful king or monumental palace. A city can emerge through cooperation, trade, craft production, and the gradual growth of connected communities. The archaeology reveals extensive craft activity. Pottery was produced, iron was worked, and specialized objects were exchanged. These activities suggest that Gengeno was not simply a farming settlement. It had become an important economic center. Ironworking is particularly significant. The presence of iron production demonstrates technological knowledge and specialized labor. Workers had to obtain ore, process it, control high temperatures, and transform raw material into tools and objects. The city also participated in long-distance exchange. Goods moved through the Niger Delta, connecting Gengeno with other communities across West Africa. The waterways provided natural transportation routes, while overland paths connected the settlement with surrounding regions. Imagine arriving at Gengeno during its period of prosperity. The delta would have been alive with activity. Boats moving through the waterways, farmers working near the settlement, fishermen bringing in their catch, craftsmen producing pottery and iron objects, and traders moving between different communities. The landscape itself would have been part of the city's infrastructure. Waterways served as transportation routes, wetlands provided resources, and elevated areas provided places for permanent construction. The inhabitants adapted their settlement to the rhythm of the river. The architecture was mostly built from mud brick, a practical material in the region. Walls could be constructed relatively quickly, but they required maintenance. Rain, flooding, and erosion could gradually damage exposed buildings. Over generations, old structures were rebuilt, new compounds appeared, and layers of occupation accumulated. This created the archaeological mound that survives today. The city was therefore not built in one enormous project. It grew gradually. As communities expanded, new buildings were added, and older areas were modified. The result was a complex urban landscape created over centuries. Gengeno also challenges older ideas about the origins of African cities. For a long time, Ancient urbanism in Africa was often discussed mainly through Egypt and later Mediterranean influences. But Guangzhou demonstrates that complex urban life developed independently in West Africa. Its growth was closely connected with local geography, regional trade, agriculture, fishing, and craft specialization. The city did not need to copy another civilization to become urban. Eventually, the settlement began to decline. By around the 13th century AD, its importance had greatly diminished, while the nearby city of Jenne became increasingly important. The population and economic activity shifted, and Guangzhou was gradually abandoned. The reasons for this transformation remain uncertain. Changes in trade, political developments, environmental conditions, and the growth of nearby settlements may all have played a role. The archaeological evidence does not provide one simple explanation. After abandonment, the ancient settlement became covered by soil and vegetation. The mud brick structures slowly disappeared, leaving only subtle rises in the landscape. For centuries, the city remained largely hidden. Modern archaeological excavations changed that. Researchers uncovered layers of buildings, pottery, ironworking remains, beads, burials, and other evidence revealing the scale of the ancient settlement. The discoveries demonstrated that Guangzhou had been a major urban center long before the rise of many better-known medieval West African cities. Its history pushed the story of African urbanism much further into the past, and perhaps the most fascinating part is how ordinary the city can appear. There are no giant stone monuments announcing its importance. Its power was expressed through networks, production, trade, and the sheer concentration of people. Guangzhou is remarkable because it shows that one of West Africa's earliest cities could grow without the monumental palaces and massive stone architecture we often associate with ancient civilization. People built with mud brick, traveled through waterways, produced iron and pottery, traded across the region, and created an urban community that lasted for centuries. Eventually, the city fell silent. Its buildings returned to the earth, and the Niger Delta continued to change around it. But beneath the soil of Mali, the remains of Guangzhou still preserve the story of a city that developed its own form of urban life, long before much of its history was ever written down. The forgotten city of La Quemada, high above the dry landscape of central Mexico, a massive stone settlement climbs across a rugged hillside. Terraces, huge platforms, defensive walls, and monumental stairways stretch across the mountain. There are no towering pyramids like those of Teotihuacan, and no written record explaining exactly who built the city. This is La Quemada, one of the most mysterious archaeological sites in northern and central Mexico. La Quemada is located in the modern state of Zacatecas, within a landscape of dry valleys and rocky hills. The location immediately stands out. Instead of being constructed on a broad, flat plain, the settlement rises across a steep hill. Its builders transformed the natural slope into a monumental complex. Stone walls were constructed across different levels, creating terraces and platforms. Massive stairways connected the lower and upper sections, while defensive walls protected important areas. The result is a settlement that feels almost like a fortress. But La Quemada was more than a defensive site. The complex contains large ceremonial and architectural spaces, including plazas, platforms, and structures that required considerable organization to construct. One of the most famous features is the Hall of Columns, a large rectangular space containing massive stone columns. The exact purpose of the structure remains uncertain, but its scale suggests that it played an important role within the settlement. Nearby, another monumental structure rises above the hillside. The votive pyramid dominates part of the complex, its elevated position making it one of the most recognizable features of La Quemada. The architecture is especially interesting because it does not fit neatly into the traditions of the major civilizations farther south. La Quemada developed its own distinctive architectural style, using locally available stone, large platforms, and carefully constructed terraces. The city flourished during the first millennium AD, but exactly who built it remains one of the site's biggest questions. Different interpretations have connected La Quemada with several ancient cultural groups, but there is no definitive evidence identifying a single civilization as its builders. This uncertainty has contributed to the site's mystery. We can see what they built, but we cannot always say exactly what they called themselves. Their political system, their language, and many aspects of their beliefs remain difficult to reconstruct. Imagine approaching La Quemada during its period of occupation. The hillside would have looked very different. Structures would have stood across the terraces. People would have moved between plazas, and the large stone platforms would have dominated the surrounding landscape. The settlement's elevated position also provided visibility. From the upper terraces, the surrounding valleys could be observed from a considerable distance. This would have been useful for communication, movement, and potentially defense. The defensive architecture is one of the most striking aspects of the site. Walls were positioned along the natural contours of the hill, creating controlled approaches. Visitors could not simply walk directly into the central complex. They had to follow specific routes. This suggests that movement through La Quemada may have been carefully controlled. The architecture created a sequence, from lower areas, up stairways, through gates, and toward the monumental structures above. But was La Quemada actually a fortress? The answer is not completely straightforward. Some features clearly have defensive potential, yet the site also contains ceremonial architecture. It may have served several functions at once. The city could have been a political center, a ceremonial location, a regional settlement, or a place that controlled important routes through the surrounding landscape. These possibilities are not necessarily mutually exclusive. La Quemada's location may have been especially important because it sits near routes connecting different regions of ancient Mexico. Trade and movement across northern Mesoamerica brought people, goods, and ideas through the landscape. A settlement positioned above those routes could benefit from that activity. Archaeologists have also found evidence of craft production and everyday occupation. Pottery, stone tools, and other artifacts reveal that people lived and worked here, not simply visited the site for ceremonies. The settlement, therefore, appears to have supported a community capable of maintaining monumental architecture. That required food, water, labor, and organization. The enormous structures could not have existed without a broader society supporting them. Eventually, La Quemada was abandoned. The reasons are uncertain. Changes in climate, political instability, shifts in trade, or changing settlement patterns may have contributed. But the community eventually left the hill. After abandonment, the stone structures remained exposed to the elements. Vegetation grew across some areas, while erosion gradually damaged others. But much of the architecture survived because it had been built from massive stone. Over time, the identity of the ancient settlement was forgotten. Local traditions developed around the ruins, while the original purpose of many structures became unclear. The city became a mysterious presence in the landscape. Modern archaeological investigations gradually revealed its complexity. Researchers mapped the terraces, excavated buildings, studied artifacts, and reconstructed parts of the ancient settlement. But excavation has not solved every mystery. The absence of a clear written record makes La Quemada especially difficult to interpret. Archaeologists must reconstruct its history from architecture, artifacts, burials, and the relationship between the settlement and its environment. The site also demonstrates how diverse ancient Mexico really was. The famous civilizations of central and southern Mexico are only part of the story. Farther north, communities developed their own monumental traditions. La Quemada is one of the clearest examples. The mountain city of Taxila. Taxila was located in the Potahar Plateau of modern Pakistan, near important routes connecting the Indian subcontinent with Central Asia and Afghanistan. Its position was one of the city's greatest advantages. Merchants could travel through the mountain passes, armies could move between regions, and ideas could spread along the same routes. Taxila was not a single city built once. It developed through several major settlements over different periods. The archaeological remains include Pir Mound, Sirkap, and Sursuk, each representing a different stage in the city's long history. The oldest major settlement is Pir Mound. Its irregular streets and dense occupation reflect an early phase of Taxila's development. The settlement grew over generations, as houses, workshops, and public spaces were added to an increasingly important urban center. Later, a very different city emerged. This was Sirkap, a settlement established during the period of Indo-Greek rule. Unlike the irregular layout of Pir Mound, Sirkap was planned with a more organized street system. Straight roads crossed the settlement, creating blocks of buildings and clearly defined urban spaces. The city reflected architectural traditions from across the ancient world. Greek, Persian, and Indian influences appeared together. One of the most fascinating features is that these different traditions existed side by side. A Buddhist monument could stand near architecture influenced by the Hellenistic world, while local Indian traditions remained visible in other structures. Taxila became a crossroads not only for trade, but for ideas. Imagine walking through Sirkap during its period of prosperity. Merchants would have moved through the streets. Craftsmen would have worked in workshops. Religious communities would have gathered at sacred sites, and travelers from distant regions would have passed through the city. Taxila's religious importance was enormous. The region became one of the major centers of Buddhist learning and activity. Monasteries and stupas were constructed across the surrounding landscape, turning the region into a major religious center. One of the best-known monuments is the Dharmarajika Stupa, a large Buddhist monument surrounded by smaller structures and monastic remains. Its presence demonstrates how closely religious institutions were connected with the urban world of Taxila. But Taxila was not exclusively Buddhist. The city's archaeological remains reflect a remarkably diverse cultural environment. Different religious traditions, architectural styles, and artistic influences existed across the region. The city also became famous for learning. Ancient sources associate Taxila with education, although the idea of a single centralized university in the modern sense is too simplistic. Instead, the region supported teachers, students, monasteries, and specialized centers of learning. This made Taxila more than a trading city. It became a place where knowledge traveled. Students and scholars could encounter ideas from different parts of South Asia and beyond. The city's position also brought wealth. Trade routes carried valuable goods through the region, including textiles, spices, metalwork, precious materials, and other products. Taxila benefited from its position between major cultural zones, but the same location that brought wealth also brought conquest. Taxila changed hands repeatedly. The city came under the influence of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, later became associated with the campaigns of Alexander the Great, and eventually came under the rule of powerful South Asian kingdoms. Alexander's arrival connected Taxila with the expanding Hellenistic world. Greek soldiers, officials, artists, and merchants entered regions that had previously developed along different cultural traditions. The later Indo-Greek period left a particularly strong architectural imprint. Sirkap's layout reflects this multicultural environment. But the city was never simply Greek. Local traditions remained deeply embedded within the settlement. Later, the Kushan Empire became dominant in the region. Taxila continued to flourish, and Buddhist institutions became increasingly important. The city participated in a wider network stretching across Central and South Asia. This period was particularly important for Buddhist art and culture. Ideas moved along trade routes, and artistic traditions traveled between India, Central Asia, and regions farther west. Taxila stood directly within these networks. Eventually, the city's fortunes changed. Political power shifted, trade routes evolved, and new centers became more important. Taxila was eventually devastated during the invasions associated with the Huns in the 5th century AD. After this, the ancient urban center declined dramatically. The city was abandoned, buildings collapsed, and the once busy streets became silent. But the ruins survived across the landscape. Modern archaeology revealed just how extensive the ancient city had been. Excavations uncovered streets, houses, monasteries, stupas, workshops, fortifications, and countless artifacts. Together, they revealed a city that had experienced centuries of cultural transformation. What makes Taxila particularly fascinating is that there is no single Taxila. There are several cities layered across the same region, each reflecting a different historical period. Pir Mound, Sirkap, and Sursuk together create a timeline of urban development. The ruins therefore allow archaeologists to watch a city transform. An earlier settlement gives way to a new urban plan. New rulers introduce different architectural traditions. Religious institutions expand, and the city's connections with the wider world change. Taxila is remarkable because it was never simply one civilization's city. It was a meeting point. Persian influence, Greek architecture, Indian traditions, Buddhist institutions, and Central Asian connections all crossed through the same landscape. For centuries, merchants traveled its roads, scholars gathered here, kings fought for control, and religious communities built monuments across its hills. Eventually, the city fell silent. But the roads, monasteries, stupas, and ancient streets remain. Across the hills of northern Pakistan, Taxila still preserves the story of a city where civilizations met and where the ancient world became far more interconnected than we might imagine. The ruined city of Ebla. In the dry landscape of northern Syria, a massive ancient mound rises above the surrounding plain. From the surface, it looks almost like an ordinary hill, but beneath the earth, an entire Bronze Age city is buried. Palaces, temples, administrative buildings, and thousands of ancient clay tablets once lay hidden inside. This is Ebla, one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the ancient Near East. The ancient city is located at Tel Mardik, in the fertile region between the Mediterranean coast and the great cities of Mesopotamia. Its position was extremely important. Routes connecting Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world passed through this region. Ebla could therefore benefit from trade, agriculture, and its position between powerful neighboring kingdoms. The city reached its greatest known importance during the 3rd millennium BC, when Ebla became the center of a powerful kingdom. Its rulers controlled surrounding territories, collected resources, and maintained diplomatic and economic connections with distant regions. But for thousands of years, almost all of this disappeared beneath the mound. The palace walls collapsed, buildings were buried, and the city gradually became part of the landscape. What survived was hidden beneath layers of soil. Then archaeology began to uncover the city. Excavations at Tel Mardik revealed monumental architecture, storage areas, temples, and eventually one of the most extraordinary discoveries of all: thousands of clay tablets. The tablets transformed the understanding of Ebla. Written in cuneiform, they preserved information about administration, trade, rations, people, places, and political relationships. For archaeologists, this was like finding an archive from the ancient city itself. Imagine the palace when these records were still being used. Scribes would sit inside administrative rooms, pressing signs into wet clay with a reed stylus. A small tablet could record quantities of grain, livestock, textiles, or other goods. Larger documents could preserve much more complicated information. The archive reveals something extremely important. Ebla was not simply a large settlement. It had an organized administration capable of recording and managing resources across a substantial territory. Officials, scribes, workers, merchants, and rulers were all connected through this system. The city also had a complex economy. Agriculture provided much of the foundation. The surrounding landscape could produce grain, raise animals, and support the population. But Ebla also depended on exchange with neighboring regions. Goods moved into and out of the kingdom, including metals, timber, textiles, food products, and other valuable materials. The tablets provide evidence of this economic activity, giving archaeologists a rare view into Bronze Age administration. The city's political connections were equally important. Ebla interacted with other powerful centers across Syria and Mesopotamia. Diplomatic relationships, trade agreements, and political competition shaped the kingdom's position. The rulers of Ebla therefore operated within a much larger international world. They were not isolated in northern Syria. Their interests extended across hundreds of kilometers, connecting them with other cities and kingdoms. But the city eventually faced destruction. During the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, Ebla was violently destroyed. The exact circumstances remain debated, but the archaeological evidence shows that large parts of the city were burned and abandoned. The destruction had an unexpected consequence. The fire that destroyed the palace also helped preserve many of the clay tablets. As buildings collapsed, the tablets were buried beneath debris. The archive that represented the city's administration became sealed inside the ruins. This is why the destruction of Ebla became so valuable to modern archaeology. A catastrophe for the ancient inhabitants created a remarkable archaeological record for us. The ruins preserve a moment when a functioning Bronze Age kingdom suddenly came to an end. But Ebla did not simply vanish forever. The site was occupied again during later periods, and the settlement changed as new populations and political powers entered the region. The ancient city, therefore, contains several layers of history. Later, Ebla was never identical to the powerful kingdom of the 3rd millennium BC. Its political importance changed, but the mound remained occupied at different times. Eventually, The site was abandoned and gradually became dominated by the remains beneath it. The architecture provides another glimpse into the city's importance. Large palace complexes, ceremonial spaces, temples, and administrative buildings demonstrate the resources available to the rulers. These structures required enormous amounts of labor. Mud brick was one of the most important building materials. The dry climate allowed substantial sections of mud brick architecture to survive, although erosion continues to threaten exposed remains. The contrast is striking. The original city would have been full of color, movement, voices, animals, and activity. Today, only fragments of its walls remain visible. The rest lies beneath the mound. And yet, the clay tablets allow us to hear something of the city's ancient administration. Names, quantities, places, and transactions survive in written form. The people of Ebla are no longer completely silent. The tablets also reveal the complexity of Bronze Age society. Different occupations, different levels of authority, and organized systems of taxation and distribution appear in the records. The city depended on an administrative structure far more sophisticated than the ruins alone might suggest. But the archive also creates new mysteries. Not every ancient word can be translated with certainty. Some place names remain difficult to identify, and the precise meaning of certain records continues to be debated. Even when the ancients left written information, their world can still be difficult for us to reconstruct. The buried settlement of Sayanu. Sayanu lies near the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, in a landscape where the fertile plains of northern Mesopotamia meet the mountains. Thousands of years ago, this environment provided access to wild plants, animals, water, and routes connecting different ecological zones. For early communities, that combination was extremely valuable. The settlement was occupied beginning around the 9th millennium BC, during the Neolithic period. This was a time of enormous transformation. Human groups were gradually moving away from highly mobile lifestyles, and some communities were beginning to live in permanent settlements. Sayanu preserves that transition in extraordinary detail. The buildings are one of the site's most important features. Archaeologists discovered several different architectural phases, showing that the settlement was repeatedly rebuilt and reorganized. The people living here did not construct one permanent village and leave it unchanged. They continually modified their environment. Some of the earliest structures were relatively simple, but later buildings became increasingly sophisticated. Stone foundations, mud brick walls, prepared floors, and carefully organized spaces appear throughout the settlement. One of the most unusual features is the grill plan building tradition, where parallel stone walls created narrow channels beneath raised floors. The exact purpose of these structures remains debated, but their construction demonstrates considerable architectural planning. Later, other building forms appeared. Large communal or specialized structures were constructed, including buildings that appear to have served functions beyond ordinary domestic life. This suggests that the settlement contained different kinds of spaces for different activities. Imagine walking through Sayanu thousands of years ago. There would have been compact houses, people preparing food, craftsmen working with stone, and groups moving through shared spaces. Outside the buildings, the surrounding landscape would have provided plants, animals, and other resources. The settlement is especially important for understanding the development of agriculture. Early inhabitants relied heavily on wild resources, but over time, evidence suggests increasing management and cultivation of plants, along with the domestication of animals. This transition did not happen overnight. Sayanu provides evidence for a long process, where people experimented with different ways of obtaining food. Hunting, gathering, cultivation, and animal management existed within a changing economic system. Animal remains from the site are particularly important. They provide evidence for hunting and later changes in animal use, helping archaeologists trace the gradual development of domestication. The people of Sayanu were also skilled craftspeople. Stone tools were produced, bone and antler were worked, and other materials were shaped into objects used in everyday life. One especially significant material was copper. Sayanu provides some of the earliest evidence for the working of native copper, showing that people were experimenting with metals long before the widespread development of metallurgy. This is an important distinction. The inhabitants were not yet operating Bronze Age metal industries. Instead, they were learning that naturally occurring copper could be shaped and worked. That experimentation represents an early stage in a technological transformation that would eventually reshape human societies. The settlement also contains evidence of ritual activity. Some structures and objects appear to have had special significance, suggesting that the community's world was not organized around food and shelter alone. People were creating spaces connected with social and possibly ceremonial activities. Burials provide another glimpse into their beliefs. The dead were sometimes placed within or around the settlement, creating a physical relationship between ancestors and the living community. This is important because Teonu was not simply a collection of houses. It was a community with social traditions, shared practices, and changing ideas about how people should live together. The settlement also appears to have been connected to wider regions. Materials found at Teonu originated from areas beyond the immediate surroundings, suggesting that people were exchanging objects and resources across considerable distances. This means that even during the Neolithic, communities were not completely isolated. People could travel, exchange materials, share ideas, and maintain relationships with groups living far away. Over generations, the settlement expanded and changed. New architectural traditions replaced older ones, structures were rebuilt, and the organization of the community shifted. The archaeological layers therefore form a long sequence of cultural change. Eventually, Teonu was abandoned. The reasons are not completely understood. Environmental changes, social transformations, economic shifts, or other factors may have contributed, but the settlement eventually ceased to function as the community that had occupied it for generations. The abandoned buildings collapsed, soil accumulated, and vegetation covered the remains. Over thousands of years, the settlement gradually disappeared beneath the landscape. Modern archaeology eventually revealed what was hidden. Excavations exposed walls, floors, stone tools, animal remains, burials, and specialized structures, layer by layer. The story of the settlement began to emerge. What makes Teonu so important is its position within one of the greatest transformations in human history. Here, we can observe people moving toward permanent settlement, experimenting with food production, developing new architecture, working materials such as copper, and creating increasingly complex social spaces. But this was not yet a city. There were no kings, no written bureaucracy, and no monumental empire. Instead, Teonu represents something much earlier, the foundation upon which later urban civilizations would eventually develop. The port settlement of Myos Hormos. Myos Hormos was located on the western coast of the Red Sea, in a region where the desert meets the sea with almost no natural shelter. For the people who lived here, the environment was harsh. There was little rainfall, fresh water was limited, and the surrounding mountains and desert made travel difficult. Yet this remote location became a major center of international trade. The reason was simple. The Red Sea provided a maritime route toward Arabia, East Africa, and India. Goods arriving by ship could then be transported across the Egyptian desert, eventually reaching the Nile Valley and the wider Mediterranean world. Myos Hormos became one of the links connecting these enormous trade networks. The port became particularly important during the Roman period, when Egypt was one of the most valuable provinces of the Roman Empire. Roman merchants and administrators wanted access to luxury goods arriving from the east, including spices, textiles, precious stones, and other valuable products. But getting these goods to the Mediterranean was not easy. Ships had to cross the Red Sea. Then their cargo had to travel across the desert toward the Nile. That required an entire logistical system. Ancient roads connected the port with the Nile Valley. Caravans carried goods across the desert, and settlements along the route provided places for people and animals to rest. Myos Hormos was therefore part of a much larger transportation network. Imagine arriving at the port during its busiest period. Ships would be anchored along the Red Sea, workers unloading cargo, merchants inspecting goods, animals being prepared for the desert journey, and caravans forming to transport valuable materials westward. The settlement itself was not a monumental city. Much of its architecture was practical. Storage areas, workspaces, living quarters, and facilities connected with trade. Its importance came from what moved through it. Archaeological excavations have uncovered large quantities of imported material, pottery from different parts of the Mediterranean, objects from Arabia, and goods connected with the Indian Ocean world reveal how far the port's commercial connections extended. Some discoveries are especially important because they demonstrate contact with India. Roman period trade across the Indian Ocean connected Egyptian ports with South Asian markets. and Myos Hormos was one of the Egyptian gateways into that system. The trade was not limited to luxury objects. Ships and merchants carried a wide variety of materials, while the port also supported the people required to operate the system. Sailors, merchants, port workers, caravan operators, craftsmen, and officials all depended on the settlement. The harsh environment created another challenge. Fresh water had to be managed carefully. The settlement depended on supplies brought from elsewhere, and storage facilities were essential. A major port could not function without reliable access to water. The desert also affected construction. Buildings had to cope with extreme heat, strong sunlight, wind, and occasional flooding. Many structures were built using locally available materials, including stone and mud brick. The archaeological remains reveal how practical this settlement was. There was little need for monumental architecture. Instead, the infrastructure was designed around movement. Goods arrived, were stored, sorted, loaded onto caravans, and transported across the desert. This makes Myos Hormos especially interesting. The port was effectively a machine for moving goods between two worlds. The Red Sea connected it to the Indian Ocean, while the desert road connected it to the Nile and the Mediterranean. The ancient Roman economy therefore reached much farther than the Mediterranean coastline. Goods from distant regions could eventually appear in Roman markets, because ports like Myos Hormos connected enormous chains of transportation. But the port did not remain equally important forever. Trade routes changed. Other Red Sea ports became more significant, and political and economic conditions across the region shifted. Myos Hormos gradually declined. The settlement was eventually abandoned. Buildings collapsed, and sand and desert soil covered much of the archaeological remains. The port disappeared from the active landscape. For centuries, there was little visible evidence of the settlement that had once handled international trade. The desert preserved fragments, but the larger story had become difficult to reconstruct. Modern archaeological excavations changed that. Researchers uncovered buildings, pottery, organic remains, coins, and other artifacts that revealed the port's commercial life. The objects are particularly valuable because they show how far the settlement's connections extended. A single piece of pottery can reveal a trading relationship, while a collection of imported goods can reconstruct an entire network. The archaeological evidence also reveals that life at Myos Hormos was not easy. This was a working port in one of the harshest environments imaginable. People had to transport water, maintain buildings, care for animals, and survive extreme temperatures. Yet they continued to operate the port because the economic rewards were enormous. The demand for goods from the east created a trade network that was worth crossing deserts and seas to maintain. Myos Hormos is remarkable because one of the most important links between Rome and the Indian Ocean was built in an environment that seems almost impossible for a major settlement. Ships arrived from the Red Sea. Goods were unloaded. Caravans carried them across the desert, and eventually those products reached the Nile and the Mediterranean world. For centuries, the port connected distant cultures through trade. Then the routes changed. The settlement was abandoned, and the desert slowly buried the evidence. Today, its ruins preserve the remains of a forgotten trading world, a place where Roman Egypt met the Red Sea, and where goods from some of the most distant parts of the ancient world entered the Mediterranean economy.